Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging all the Indigenous First Nations people around the globe who are traditional custodians of their land on which they stand. And I want to pay special respects to their elders past and present. I also extend that respect to everybody that's joined us today and throughout the conference. Ngā mihi nui mai hana. Hei karakia whakahuki mai e te mauri ngā hapori. Hei hoki mai te whakawhanaketanga hapori, hoki mai te mauri, hoki mai te aki, kia tupu ria, kia tupu matamato, kia tupu hapori mo moho e, humi e, hui e, taiki e. Kia ora, Allison.
Thank you. Thank you, Corinna. So we have over 600 registrants for this Unconference, and we just want to mention a few things before the presentation. And then if we have time after, we can provide some more information about the Unconference. I get so excited for this event because of the international flair, as well as the whole 48-hour concept. But we know that it can be confusing. So make sure that you have access to a program, either printed or online. It is in multiple places and in the rooms. The program for each room the schedule for each room is in there. This time zone thing can be tricky. So make sure to look at the program for the time of session you want to go to in your time zone and the day. Also within the welcome space, which is the first page or room you land in within Kiko, there are several pieces of information. And if you need any tech help, just ask. We can help in the live chat in the bottom right-hand corner of Kiko, or in the chat here in Zoom as you're running into difficulties. So now I have the great privilege to introduce John McKnight, one of the founders of the ABCD Institute, as well as Deb Wisniewski, who, as well as myself, Allison Lourash, is a steward of the ABCD Institute. The three of us are going to share, and then there will be some time for questions. So you can put questions in the chat too. And it'd be really helpful if folks mute too while the presentation continues. Thank you. Thanks, John. John, you're muted.
All right, we'll try her again. This is a wonderful experience because we have all come home together from around the world. And we're especially interested here in the ABCD world. And it's, I think, our job, Deb and Allison and myself, to sort of begin this adventure on this Unconference by sort of opening the window into the world of ABCD. What's it all about, right? And I think that when we think of it as an event where we're opening the window, the question is, what might you see? And a lot of people know a lot about ABCD, and so they've looked through the window and they know what's there in that world. But we thought that probably it'd be useful for those of you who are not as familiar with ABCD, asset-based community development, if we gave you a sort of a background. And the way we're going to try to do that is to talk about the 4 essentials of an ABCD practice. And then Allison and Deb are each going to tell a story that takes these elements and makes them vivid and real. So that's the plan here. We should say, as an introduction, that asset-based community development was chosen as a way of thinking about the world, not in terms of its emptiness, problems, deficits, and needs, but think about it in terms of its gifts, capacity, skills, and interests. So there's a whole world. If you open there's another window in the world, and if you open that window, you're going to see needs, but we're opening a window where you're going to see assets. And so let me begin by saying that there are, I think, 5 basic assets. And by that, we mean the building blocks that people in localities, in smaller places, use when they want to improve their lives and become productive. Derived this from research all over the world in terms of localities. How did people go about doing things locally where they were the producers of the future and their own well-being? And our research found that there were 5 building blocks that they used. So let me quickly go over them. The first building block is the gifts and capacities of individuals in a local place. They are the essential raw material from which productive neighborhoods grow. And in general, we think that a way to find out about what individuals have in terms of capacities is to find out about their gifts, their skills, their passions, and their knowledge. And when you know that, you have a starting point in terms of beginning to do something with that building block. Second building block is local clubs, groups, organizations, or associations, we would call them. But they are those groups of people in a local place who are bound together by caring about the same thing or caring about each other. And they manifest that care by not being paid. It is not, associations don't operate in the world of agencies or governments or businesses. They are smaller face-to-face groups where the members do the work and they're not paid. And they are this essential structure that allows the gifts of individuals to be connected, manifested, and show the power of the neighborhood. The third asset is the local or larger institutions. Institutions are of 3 kinds: those that are businesses, those that are governmental agencies, and those that are agencies, not-for-profit, NGO kinds of organizations. And they represent assets that are used in neighborhoods as well. However, they are very, very different than associations. And one of the things that the ABCD practice has focused on over the years is the difference between an institution and association. An association is the vehicle through which people become producers. Institutions are a different way of having things produced. But there are a lot of things that only people with their gifts and their associations can produce. And we want to conclude by indicating what those are. The next asset is the physical space, the land, the improvements, anything that's beneath the land. That's an asset that appears in the practice of a lot of people. The the next one is exchange. That is the sharing, borrowing, bartering, and buying and selling that goes on in a local place is a very important asset to understand. And the last one is stories. A story is a neighborhood's way of knowing who we are and knowing from our history what we've done that has been successful, so that we can build on what we already have achieved. So those are the assets, the basic building blocks that we are focused on if we're involved in an asset-based approach to community development. Now, the second basic element is connection or relationship. That is, the building blocks only become valuable when they're connected. And so the role of community connectors are very important. We can tell that every single example of productive local towns, neighborhoods, or groups, every one of them is the result of assets that weren't connected becoming connected, so that connections and relationships activate the assets. Now, then the third element has to do with how would you proceed to use these elements by connecting them. And yet you do recognize that there's a world of institutions as well. But an ABCD approach always starts with the center, the associations, and the citizens. This is a primary producer. So if we want to do anything, the first question is, what do we have as building blocks that we can use to make our neighborhood better? The second question in this process is, what is it that we could do with what we have if we had some outside help from an institution, from a local business, maybe from a library or from some agency, right? So that's the second question. The third question isn't really a question. If you know what with our own assets we can achieve, and you know what with our own assets and the support of institutions we can achieve, we'll still find there are things we can't achieve. And that's when institutions come into play. Where we have to say to the institutions, we can't do it. You have things that you are uniquely able to do, so you can do it. And we want to work with you in that process. So it's those three steps. But whenever you start with what can an institution do, I think that's un-ABCD. ABCD always starts with, if you like the word, citizens or residents or neighbors, and never starts by saying, what can institutions do for us? It is, what can we do with our powerful assets? And then how can institutions step in? The fourth element has to do with functions. A neighborhood, a community, a town, and we're always thinking small here, we're not thinking big cities, but in a local place, right, there are 7 possibilities for what we could do if we connected our assets and then brought institutions in an appropriate way. And so let me conclude by indicating what those 7 functions are. Think about a neighborhood, and it is, if it's a powerful place, a place you want to live, you want to be, that is productive, above all productive, there are these areas, these functions that neighborhoods, localities, very local communities have a significant possibility of producing. The first is health. Health is more likely to be generated by relationships at the local level than by doctors. The second is security and safety. And all the research shows that local security and safety has much more to do with how people work together in associations than what police do. The third one is ecology. We have an important function in making this world a place that will survive. And so in a local neighborhood, we are major determinants of the environment by how much energy we use, how much waste we produce. And a powerful neighborhood understands itself as being a central actor in loving the earth and making it survive. The next one is economy. We know that local economies produce more jobs and more businesses than any other place. More people get jobs by word of mouth in most countries than by systems or job training operations. And most businesses start locally. So if we understand ourselves that way, we are the generators of jobs, we are the generators of businesses. We are powerful producers in that sense. The next thing that we can produce is food. And that movement is growing more and more. So the local production of food helps our economy, helps our health, and builds our relationships. The 6th one, I guess, is the raising of children. We've all heard so often it takes a village to raise a child. And yet very few local places are seriously, as a group, doing things to raise their children. And in fact, a lot of things we call youth problems are really problems because the neighborhood doesn't raise its children. It leaves it to the institutions. And finally, the neighborhood and its associations are the sites of care. And by that, I mean an association is people who care about each other. And that's what holds them together, or they care about the same thing. No institution can produce care. It can produce services. So if you want to know what people care about any place, look at the village, look at the town, look at the neighborhood. So those 7 functions are exactly the domain for us as productive neighbors. And in order to fulfill these functions, we need to know what our assets are. We need to know how to connect them. And we need to know how to proceed in ways that relate to institutions so they don't dominate us, but they support us. So that's the the short report on the essentials of ABCD. And so let me toss the ball to Deb. And she and Allison will be our storytellers. Make this all alive.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I feel like John just gave us the speed dating version of ABCD. You know, just took a lot of really amazing concepts and packaged them all in a nice little package for us. And so my job here is to tell you a story. And first I have to tell you this story, I have to just mention where I live, because it's a story about something in our town. I live in a really small community of about 700 people. We happen to be, it's in Wisconsin in the United States. And we happen to be on an island on Lake Michigan, which is one of the Great Lakes in the United States. We're about a half an hour ferry ride from the mainland. And we have our own store, and we have our own restaurants, and we have our own school district. In fact, it's the smallest school district in the state of Wisconsin. Sometimes we only have, I think our biggest class of graduates one year was 6 kids, but often it's as small as 1 or 2 kids graduating from high school. So the story, though, that I want to tell you specifically about is about a quilting group. At one of the churches on the island, we have a couple different churches, and at one of the churches, the Lutheran church, is a quilting group. Now, this quilting group is open to anyone that lives here in our community, that lives in the island. And in fact, when we first moved here about 3.5 years ago, they were trying to recruit me to join the quilting group, but not being a sewer, I decided my role was to admire their work. But here's the thing about the quilting group. They do some of the stuff that you would expect community quilting groups to do. They make quilts for people who are going through difficult times, for example, or going through, so if someone is ill or there's some kind of situation going on with a family, they may make a quilt for that person or that family. They make quilts for new babies on the island. Every new baby here, everyone knows about and celebrates. But one of the things that they started doing quite a number of years ago is they started creating quilts for the high school graduates. Each and every quilt is designed for that specific young person. So if you are someone who likes horses, for example, your quilt will have a horse theme to it, if you will. It might have material that has horses on it, or somehow it might relate to something that you are passionate and that you care about. Or if your family has been on the island for generations, your quilt may include a piece of blue jeans worn by your great-grandfather because someone happened to have saved those pair of blue jeans. So your quilt might incorporate that. Now, the process of doing this is a year-long process, and every quilt is assigned a lead quilter who really thinks about and gets to know that young person and sort of leads the making of that quilt. But the whole group is involved in making a quilt for each graduate. Then in June, when graduation comes along, this was pre-COVID, graduation was like a 3-hour affair, no matter if we only had 2 graduates. It's a little different with COVID now, but they're hoping to get back to some of the in-person stuff they didn't have before. But typically there would be a ceremony, and there'd be a potluck, and there'd be a dance, and the whole island comes to graduation. So it's quite a crowd. It lasts 3 hours long. And as part of the graduation ceremony, each student is presented with their quilt. And the students, if you ask the students what their favorite part of graduation is, they'll tell you. I even asked one student this once, and she said, "I can't wait to see my quilt," because they don't know what the quilt looks like until it's presented at graduation. And then no matter what that student is going to go on and do, whether they're going to stay here on the island, they're going off to work or to serve in some way, or they have they're going to college or university somewhere else, no matter what they're doing, these quilts are prized possessions of the students. And it's when I first heard this story, I was struck by the just the compassion and caring of this community for our students. And, you know, as John was talking about those 7 functions of communities, you know, 2 of them kind of jumped out at me. One of them was the raising of our children as being a community function. And I see that the quilt story as being a reflection of that raising of our children by the community. Because, you know, even though there's like a lead quilter for each quilt, all the quilters contribute. People throughout the community are involved in the quilt making. You know, people know these kids. They know these kids. I mean, I've only lived here 3.5 years, and I'm really excited about somebody that's going to be graduating this year because I already know some of their stories. So there's the raising of the children, there's this connection, and I could tell you lots of stories about how they're connected to each other. But the other one that struck me out of the functions too was this idea of enabling health. And I think that includes both physical health and mental health. And as I think about students who are perhaps leaving, you know, our community, leaving the island to go out into the bigger world, they're taking along a piece of their community with them. They're taking along this love and care that went into the making of their quilt. And I can't help but think that this really contributes to their mental health, no matter where they go in the world. And that they feel like they're always welcome back to this community, that they're always going to be a part of this community. So I love that story. I wanted to share that story specifically with you all. And I'm going to put a brief plug in here for our session on rural communities, which is right after the plenary. I think we're in the green room, if I'm not mistaken. But we're going to be, you know, people are going to be sharing more stories about rural communities and how ABCD shows up in rural communities. And it should be a real fun time. So hopefully you're going to join us. I'm going to pass the baton on to Allison to share her story next. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Deb. I'll also put a plug in that Deb's story is in our ebook, which you'll hear about multiple times during the next 48 hours. So one of my favorite things about ABCD is just the simple question, what can communities do for themselves? You know, in the context of the 3 questions that John laid out. And I think this story really reminds me of that. So I wanted to talk about a time bank that I was involved in. And for those that are not familiar, a time bank is a form of exchange. You give or get time by exchanging, by doing things for your neighbors or having your neighbors do things for you. So a very ABCD idea. You share your gifts, and in exchange, you connect with others who share their gifts with you. And as you do that, you get to know people in your community and relationships. So I'm a person with a disability, which isn't always apparent on Zoom. And I really think time banks are a way for people with disabilities and ABCD in general to not only connect with their neighborhoods, but also give their gifts. So many times people with disabilities are not expected to reciprocate in their community. So as we're starting this time bank, I thought of who do I know who would be interested in have gifts, not necessarily based on disability. And as we invited all different types of people, including citizens with disabilities who were not, who were just there as citizens, as well as different friends and other people we knew in our community, one of the things that was something we need to work through is that some of the people who were involved in creating the time bank were affiliated with institutions and felt that the time bank should sit within the institution, a particular institution that was a human services provider. to be able to provide support, whether it be managing the books or just that general support. And so the interesting thing when we think about the components of ABCD is that we worked through this and instead looked at organizations that were there for the entire community. And the other thing that I think was important from growing this time bank was that citizens interacted with sectors of the community that they were not familiar with. We looked who would be interested in joining us, and some from the arts community and environmental folks, which aligned with what the strong assets were in our town. And it was interesting that those from the human services organizations brought along their friends and neighbors, not their clients or consumers, as you might call them. And the other thing that I wanted to share about how that time bank came about by really looking at the community is that the exchanges that the time bank had and used as examples. So, what does that look like in terms of what do your exchanges look like? So it might be mowing somebody's grass or baking something if you're very gifted in baking. But it's also about telling the stories or history of a community if you've lived there for a long time, or sharing information or knowledge. And so when I think of the exchanges for that time bank, I think being so community centered really came, the different types of exchanges that we used as examples came from the community in really innovative ways from individual citizens. And so when I think of those 7 functions of community, I think about the ways that this situation created relationships that enhanced health and security in terms of knowing your neighbors and knowing who their friends are and how who they're interacting with the community, as well as the inclusion of children in potlucks or shared meals. And I also think about how it evolved with the inclusion of the different associations that we connected with rather than the institutions, and looking to those associations first as we grew. So that's a very brief synopsis of the time bank that that as an example of the 7 functions of the community. So now we're going to open it up for some questions. Either you can ask them or put them in the chat for the next few minutes. And Daniela has the question of, I wonder how you could use the idea of the time bank in an international development context. So I think about what is the who, like who is the community, who are the citizens? So, what does that look like? That's my initial thought. So
I think, Allison, if you don't mind me jumping in too, because I've done some work with time bank folks. I think, time banks, if you go to timebanks.org, there's a very specific structure and it gives you specific ideas about how to set up a time bank. But I think time banks can be done either formally or informally. So, the idea of helping people connect with each other, it's that idea of connecting and sharing their gifts. I think about when my daughter was quite young and there was a group of us that very informally shared childcare together. We took turns taking care of each other's kids. So it's really about getting people together and asking them, what are your gifts? What could you offer? And how could we set this up so people could do this? So again, if you go to timebanks.org, you might get some ideas about doing that more formally. But I think if you're creative, you can come up with some ideas among the community members in the community too.
Can I add something? One of the things that we've found over the years in terms of local places, that when you ask people about their gifts and their skills, passions, and what they know, their knowledge, right? That, but you, and then if they will tell you usually, and then you ask them, would you share these in your neighborhood with your neighbors? Would you contribute these kinds of abilities and skills in your neighborhood? Almost everybody will answer yes. But if you went to the neighborhood before asking that question, you're very likely to see almost nobody is sharing their gifts in any systematic way at all. So time bank is one way of making systematic the sharing. But more broadly, and I think this is one of the most wonderful things I can share, that we know on every block, almost every household, there is a person who has gifts, and when you ask them, would you be willing to share them? Almost all say yes. So what you have in every block or small community in town is people with all kinds of things they're willing to contribute, but they aren't very much. And so ABCD is a process by which you invite people to do something they really want to do, and that is to share their gifts. So when you think about an ABCD community, you walk out of your front door, think this: all of these houses are filled with people who are waiting to contribute those things that they value the most about themselves. And if we don't have a way of connecting them, then our block will always remain relatively dead. Other question?
There's a question in the chat of, when we talk about the 7 functions, do all the functions need to be present in a community for ABC to be fully realized? Or will there be 1 or 2 that are realized?
Yeah, I don't think that one has to have every one of those functions being fulfilled. I think that to be a wonderful goal, but supposing just a block said, you know, we've looked at a lot of findings, and what we do has more on this block has more to do with how long we'll live and how often we're going to be sick than anything doctors or hospitals can do. Let's start there. Let's make ourselves a healthy block. And let's understand that it is relationships that have more to do with your physical and mental health than almost anything else that can happen. So building what we would call social capital, right, is a way of making life so much better. So you start with 1 or maybe 3. It depends on what people we're interested in. Find out how many people here would like to see if we can't grow enough food on this block to feed almost all of us all summer long, right? How many people here want to get together and figure out what we can do with young people who we think mainly are problems that have a lot to do with our security? We're the problem, right? Not the kids. So you can take 1 of these, 2 of these, or all of these, but they all give you a different idea of who we are. We are the producers of our lives here, collective producers.
Any other questions?
There was one from Jerry further up that Deb was answering. I don't know if Jerry wants to speak to that one, maybe.
Hi, Dee. Yeah, thanks, Deb, as well for the response there. And yeah, I agree. I think what I was thinking about really there in terms of virtual communities was that yes, you know, the internet as we are now is a tool of communication, but also I think there are virtual communities as well as we are, you know, tonight, a virtual community. So I just thought my point, I suppose, was really, you know, is that an aspect of ABCD because we're not necessarily in a locality? And I suppose it's the thing about how does the locality, the neighborhood level, is that what makes ABCD, and a virtual community something else?
Well,
I think-
my
I think-
personal
go ahead.
take on, oh, go ahead, John. Sorry, John, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, well, John knows, like, I've been doing, I've worked with ABCD in Action, which is our online community, for quite a long time now. And if you haven't heard about it, about ABCD in Action, I'll stick the website in the chat for you. But, you know, I think, you know, ABCD applies primarily to places, you know, physical places and locations. But having said that, I think the principles can be applied in just about any type of community that you can think of. I mean, I even think about, like, you know, work communities, you know, or the community of my faith community, which may or may not be a place-based kind of community. Thanks, Dee. She put the link in there. You know, so I don't think that, again, you know, technology is a tool to connect people, like lots of different kinds of technology. But there are people that gather online because they have shared interests. And so even with, like, a place like ABCD in Action, I'm always thinking about how can we tap into the gifts and talents of individual people? How can we help people make those connections between each other? And support each other in in their own home communities, if you will. So I think it's useful. I think it's really a useful thing to have ABCD principles, no matter what kind of community you work in.
And I think virtual communities are wonderful for doing two things at least. Number one is sharing of ideas, just as we're doing here. And the second is to allow us to get people together face to face. In a lot of neighborhoods, they use the internet to identify people who will then come together face to face to do something in the neighborhood. So it's a good recruitment tool as well.
So any other questions before we transition to some other sessions? As Deb mentioned, coming up at the hour will be her session on rural communities in the green room. And in this room will be a session on evaluation for grassroots projects. And I just wanted to put, as people are transitioning to rooms and maybe taking a break, if you're having any technical assistance issues, which within Kiko or anything, feel free to mention those in the chat here, or go back into the welcome space and somebody can assist you. There are a couple different places to interact with different people participating in the conference. Within the welcome space, there is some information besides the schedule, including a map, and that was auto-generated by Kiko when you registered, as well as an FAQ if you have any questions, and we'll add to those as the conference continues. And then in the coffee break area, there's a directory that you can put your information in if you're looking to connect with others who attended the conference and things. And all of the sessions will be recorded, and those will be sent, communication about those will be sent after the unconference. So
Allison,
yes.
I forgot that you have placed in the chat a document called Neighborhood Necessities. And for those of you who want to know much more about those 7 functions and how neighborhoods have begun to fulfill those functions, it's in the chat right now, and you can access it there.
I will copy and paste it again if I can find my comment. It's also linked in the program. So too, but there you go. So thanks everybody, and have a great 48 or 47 hours now.
Bye-bye, everybody. Wonderful to be with you.